Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
I want to start today's program by thanking all of you individuals that took the time to write the program, send an email, and let me know that you are listening. It's always exciting to know that people all over the world are hearing your weekend show. And it means the world to me because there are times, and I've said this before, you wonder if taking the time to do this program is of any merit. Is anybody listening? Because I realize that, a lot of people, they listen, but they don't really get the time to maybe drop us a line or a comment about the program. But when you get one, and I get several each week, it gives me the hope and a reason and a purpose for coming back to this microphone each and every week. And so I want to start right here at the top of the program and thank all of you over the last couple of weeks that have given me a word of encouragement for your weekend show. This weekend, it's kind of where do I begin? I've got a dozen little thoughts running through my mind, and I can't seem to find a focus to where the program should go this particular weekend. I'm recording the program earlier than usual this week because my wife and I will be traveling from Florida to our place in northeast Georgia, and I wanted to make sure the program was done before we had to leave. We're not 100% certain what day we're leaving, and we'll be gone for about a week or two and take care of some things up in Georgia. The program will probably originate next weekend from Georgia and perhaps even the week after that. And I want to thank those that give me the opportunity to use their studios up in Georgia to record the program and get it prepared in enough time to get it to all the radio stations around the world, literally, that are airing the program now. I was thinking, one of the thoughts that ran across my mind this past weekend. In the United States, we had a big day this past week. It was Super Bowl Sunday. Now, I know in some parts of the world, football is defined very differently than we do in the United States. I guess football is what we call soccer in this country. But we had two teams that came to the top of their leagues, and they played in the Super Bowl this past weekend. To be honest, I didn't watch it. I used to watch a lot of football, but over the last several years, I've just gotten away from spending any time at all, spending any time watching football. And maybe it's because I'm getting a little tired of a lot of these players. They make millions of dollars. They seem to have a higher rate of people committing crimes within their player ranks. Some of the things that they do to taunt some people in the United States with disrespecting the national anthem and what have you, all these things just wear me down. And I'm at the point that so many people that are celebrities think that their opinions mean more than anybody else's, and oftentimes many of these celebrities are very misinformed on facts, and they just go by feelings and emotions, and whatever the topic of the day is, they just line up in suit. And I'm just getting tired of celebrities that feel they need to be controlling the conversation in a nation. Especially those that are, like I say, so ill-informed on many of the topics that they talk about. So I just don't spend as much time watching celebrities on television. I watch very little TV compared to maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I watch a fraction of the amount of television I watched before. I tend to watch documentaries. I tend to look for things that are educational. I tend to look for things that are newsworthy. I tend to, if I'm looking for entertainment, Try to find something that is wholesome, that gives you something, a takeaway that is valuable. In today's movie culture, it's so difficult to find a movie that is not filled with obscenities, violence, or sex scenes. I guess back in the day that I came up, it was a lot easier. And I know that I'm in my 60s, so I'm looking back 40-some-odd years ago. How things have changed in our society. How things we would never do. If somebody told me 40 years ago some of the things you would see on TV now, I would say you're absolutely crazy. There's some cable channels that have decided that they can use all kinds of never-before-used language not suitable for children in their programming. And it makes me more conscious of why am I spending money to have satellite television when one by one a number of these channels become something that I just don't want coming into my house. My wife and I are of a like mind on this. It just seems that we are tearing down anything that is wholesome and good and substituting things that are cheap, tawdry, bad, narcissistic, and just troublesome to my heart. We have changed so much in these 40 years that I think of going backward in my mind from the time when I first started out as a young adult, getting married and raising a family, to where we are today. I know I talk about this a lot, and I know maybe you get tired of hearing it. This connected world we live in. Yeah, I have all the devices you can imagine. I have computers, I have tablets, I have laptops, I have a very good quality smartphone, and I use these tools in my life. But I'm finding with things like Facebook, I'm not as enthralled as maybe I was a year or two ago. It seems that instead of connecting more with family and friends, you're connecting with politics and the, shall we say, star culture, the things that I really don't care about. We have this shift going on, and I worry about it. I worry about where it's taking us as a people in the Western world. It is so true that in the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, parts of Asia, there is excellent internet service and Wi-Fi. We have 4G phone service in much of the world, and now they're going to unravel the 5G, which is even significantly faster and more powerful. The goal is to connect the world on the internet. And here I sit with my program. Yeah, it's on the internet, and there are people that do listen as a podcast each and every week. But then again, there are many people in the United States that have chosen not to be as connected as others. It's not such a necessity for many people that I've met in my life. And like I say, I'm increasingly becoming one of those individuals that is concerned about what we connect ourselves to. It's hard to filter in this world that we live in the content that we behold with our eyes and absorb with our ears that enters our mind. Some of the things that I see happen, and the videos and just the general attitude of people on the internet is alarming. The things that individuals, parents no less, will post on the internet with obscenities, the foolishness. There's no redeeming value in any of it. Yet somehow we continue to tolerate all of this strange behavior and consider it normal in our society today. I can't imagine when I was younger the things that I see on network television today, those few times that I tune in, ever being permitted to be aired. I think we had a different set of moral standards and values. I'm not saying that people were any more moral or any better or cleaner, for lack of a better word. We had discretion, especially around young and innocent ears compared to today. Now we just don't care. Many parents simply just don't care what they say in front of their kids. And these children pick up on this language and they use it and they post it on their Facebook pages and their Snapchat and everything else that they're involved with today. And they think nothing of it. Anytime I used to hear certain words in my teenage years, I would cringe because they were just not a part of my vocabulary. Yet we've watched over the years how we allow language to be distorted in our society. You know, it was not that long ago here in the United States we had what's called the Grammy Awards, and this is talking about music. These are the music awards that come around once every year, and like anything else that's become some kind of a Hollywood show, it's become overtly political, which is so disappointing. Why not talk about the quality of your movies, the decency of your music, and the true impact that music can have? Music is a gift. Music can move emotions. I look back many years ago when I started out as a radio disc jockey. That's back around 1970, 71 in that area. And we used to screen all the music carefully to make sure the content was family friendly, to make sure there were no lyrics or issues that could be offensive or problematic. We tried to hold to a higher standard in any way that we could, at least when I started out in the business. I think of how music has changed since when my dad was growing up. My dad was born in the 1920s, and he was a major fan of big band music. He could play a couple of instruments as well. He could play the clarinet beautifully. And he kind of aspired when he was a teenager to be in a big band, but World War II came around, and that kind of changed his focus for several years as a Marine. The music of the 40s had a certain sound, a certain uplifting quality that could touch the heart and could stimulate the mind in positive ways. I think of songs like this from the 1940s that really stirred a generation.
I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's care
period of time in our history of World War II has always been a fascination for me to wrap my mind around what life must have been like during those years in Europe from 1939 to 1945 was truly a difficult time, a time of such uncertainty. And then with the attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941, in December of 1941, the United States entered that war, not on one front, but two, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and the Axis forces in Europe at the same time. And I've talked to people that lived through that time, like my father. My father had plans, as I mentioned before the song we played. When he was a youngster, and I want you to think, and this holds true for my wife as well, both of our dads are about the same age. They've both since passed away. My father, at age 17, enlisted in the United States Marines, and after training and additional education, he was sent to be part of he never talked much about it, but he did tell me later in life that he spent a good part of his time in the Marines with a commando unit that worked behind enemy lines in China. And I'm sure that he saw things and experienced things that he never wanted to speak of much in his life. Age 17 and overseas by age 18, and back stateside by the age of 20. My wife's dad served in Europe and was part of the D-Day invasion in 1944. Those men, when you think about the time frame and when they were born in the 1920s, just prior to the great stock market crash of 1929, and they lived their growing up years in a country that was fighting a depression, high unemployment, difficult times, and then to suddenly be leaving a childhood raised in a depression to be fighting some enemy halfway around the world. When they came back home, I'm sure they wanted to establish a better life for themselves, their brides, and their children. A life that would not be consumed by a war like they had experienced. I want to remind you, you're listening to Your Weekend Show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. If you'd like to visit our website, you can go to yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. And we also have a presence on Facebook. Just go to Facebook and search for Your Weekend Show. That's Your Weekend Show. And I've learned if you make Your Weekend Show one word, we pop right up. And you can leave your comments, suggestions, and thoughts there. A reminder that over the next several weeks, we're going to be beginning a process of redoing our website for Your Weekend Show. And our goal is to add more information and material and things of interest to the website than we've been doing of late. That's something that's been in the back of my mind for a month or so now, and we now have the time to upgrade that website. But getting back to what I was talking about, imagine 1945, and in a matter of months, the war on both fronts came to an end. In the spring, it ended in Europe, and by the end of August, it ended in the Pacific. We had VE Day, victory in Europe, and VJ Day, victory over Japan. And what a different world we suddenly awoke to at the end of those two wars, those two frontal wars. Europe changed immensely from what it had been prior to 1939. The Soviet Union participated in that war, fighting against Nazi Germany, but in the process they conquered so many countries and lands and just expanded their sphere on the world. And it's hard to believe that just a matter of a few years after the end of World War II, we entered a new period of life new time frame that was called the Cold War. You know, there's a group of us in this world, in the United States. We're called the baby boomers. I was born in 1954, as was my wife. And we are the generation whose parents went through or experienced World War II, that wanted a better life for us. And so there we are, born in this time, several years after the end of World War II, and in my case and my wife's case, right after the armistice or the ceasefire in Korea. It was truly an uncertain time even in the 1950s, though we tried to live a very normal life in the 1950s. But I think of those that went through the 1940s, that period of time in the United States from 1941 till the war ended in 1945. I've listened to old radio shows that date back to 1942, 43, and 44. And you could tell even in the entertainment programs the concern about winning and having victory on these two fronts. And there was no guarantee that a win was certain. People had rationing books. They had limitations on the things they could buy in terms of their groceries, in terms of rubber products, fuel, anything. Things were rationed because of the need of the war effort. And as I say, there was a period of time nobody knew what the outcome of this war would be on either front. We could have won on one front and lost on the other, or lost in both. Nobody knew, but there was a war effort that went on. And then we come along into the 1950s. It's a different world. We started living more in the United States, a bit more isolated from the world, though we had our influence in Europe. We had our influence in Asia. We didn't want to hear much about war anymore because we had been through World War I, World War II, the conflict in Korea. And my parents, and I know that my wife's parents, had had enough of war. We were born in a different time, a time of optimism and a time of hope in the 1950s. You know, all those returning veterans, they had the GI Bill, and many studied different trades and crafts to make a living. The beginnings of the electronics era was really in full force in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in this country. Many companies also had defense contracts as we built up a military strong enough to avoid getting into a war. And so here we are, in 1954 in my case and my wife's case, that we come into this world. And the music was a little different than what we heard in the 1940s. Here's Rosemary Clooney.
This old house once knew its children. This old house once knew his wife. This old house was home and comfort as they fought the storms of life. This old house once rang with laughter. This old house heard many shouts. Now it trembles in the darkness when the lightning walks about.
Ain't gonna need this house no longer. Ain't gonna need this house no more.
Ain't got time to fix the shingles. Ain't got time to fix the floor. Ain't got time to oil the hinges nor to mend the window pane. Ain't gonna need this house no longer. He's getting ready to meet the saints. This old house is a getting shaky. This old house is a getting old. This old house that's in the rain. This old house that's in the cold. Oh, his knees are a getting chilly, but he feels no saints. This old house once knew his children. This old house once knew his wife. This old house was home and comfort as they fought the storms of life. This old house once rang with laughter. This old house heard many shouts. Now it trembles in the darkness when the lightning walks about.
Ain't gonna need this house no longer. Ain't gonna need this house no more.
Ain't got time to fix the shingles. Ain't got time to fix the floor. Ain't got time to oil the hinges nor to mend the window pane. Ain't gonna need this house no longer. He's getting ready to meet the saints.
Ready to meet the saints.
It's hard to believe, but that was the number one song in the United States at the time that I was born in the middle of October, and my wife was born on the 1st of November. Rosemary Clooney and This Old House. The 1950s were a very different time. The suburbs were really being built out. I was raised in Long Island, and so many people had moved out of New York City and were working their way farther out on Long Island or into New Jersey or even into the upstate of New York to get away from the city to build a better life for their families, away from all the hustle and bustle. Places like Levittown, Pennsylvania, or Levittown, New York. Track housing, subdivisions built in mass quantity for these former soldiers that wanted to build a better life for their families in places like Levittown, Hicksville, Manhasset in New York. I can think of a dozen or more other communities like that. It was a time I remember as a youngster, churches being built and shopping centers being built, roads being widened, schools being put under construction. It was a very good time. It was a good time to be raised. And in the late 1950s, I entered kindergarten, and by 1960, I'm on my way to elementary school, and before you know it, we're 10 years of age, both my wife and I, and the world is beginning to change again. You see, by 1964, when we're 10 years of age, we've already had the assassination of a president, John F. Kennedy. That occurred in November of 1963. And something was brewing under the surface that would change the latter part of the 1960s in a dramatic way. It was called the Vietnam War. And how it changed us, I'll talk about in just a couple of moments. But see, at that time in 1964, music was changing dramatically again. We're no longer in the ballads and the happy songs of the 1950s. We now have the beginnings already by the late 50s of rock and roll. And by 1964, it is the British invasion. It changed music substantially for many years to come, particularly music from this well-known group. Here are the Beatles performing live on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand, I wanna hold your hand, I wanna hold your hand. Oh please, say to me, you let me be your man. And please, say to me, you let me hold your hand. You let me hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. And when I touch you, I feel happy inside. It's such a feeling that I love. I can't hide, I can't hide. think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. When I touch you, I feel happy inside. It's such a feeling that my love I can't hide. I can't hide. Yeah, you got that something. I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
I can remember that night in 1964 watching the Ed Sullivan Show and seeing the Beatles perform live. It was an experience for a guy that's not even 10 years of age yet. But, you know, over the next 5 years, taking us from 1964 to 1969, so many things were happening in the United States and around the world. Changes in the way our attitudes about everything. We started having the hippie culture develop. We had the anti-war protest developing over the war in Vietnam. And I can remember even in junior high, concerned about what my life would be like when I turned 18, not that many years away. We saw the Vietnam War coming into our television sets on the evening news every night, with stories about offenses and wars and conflicts and battles and people dying. And many people were deeply concerned about the future for those baby boomers, many of which ended up serving in Vietnam. Music changed accordingly. There were several genres of music that were very popular in the second half of the 1960s. There was the Motown sound, of course. Many of us remember those wonderful hits. There were songs of protest. There were the typical love songs that came out. But there was a underculture developing within our society. We became very divided by the summer of 1968, and riots broke out all over the United States over everything from civil rights to the war in Vietnam. We were becoming increasingly a nation with deep concerns. 1969, the summer of 1969, there was an event that occurred on a small farm in upstate New York. It was called Woodstock. And many of the great performers of the day appeared at that once-in-a-lifetime, never-duplicated again music festival. Oh, it was a mess with the rain and the mud and the hundreds of thousands of people that descended upon that event. I was just a little bit too young to attend. Had I been a year or two older, I would have probably been there because I lived only about an hour and a half away in upstate New York. And chances are I would have found a way to get there. But it's probably just as well that I didn't during that time. Music reflected so much of our society in the 1960s. Like I say, from Motown to protest songs and all points in between. But a funny thing happened in 1969. There was a song recorded in 1968. It was never intended to be a, shall we say, popular song on Top 40 radio, but a radio station in San Francisco got a hold of a pressing of an album for a choir of all things, and the disc jockey there in San Francisco kind of liked the song, and he played it, and it became very popular, and in a matter of less than a year, it became a top 40 song across the United States, a kind of an unintended number one hit. Of all things, the Edwin Hawkins Singers. By the way, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. We're kind of going through the life of a baby boomer, I guess. I didn't intend to go in this direction today, but it just seems kind of fun to do and to bring back some memories. Like I said, the Edwin Hawkins Singers had this #1 hit so unexpectedly heard on Top 40 Radio. Oh, Happy Day.
Oh, a happy day. Oh, a happy day. When Jesus was. Oh, when he was. When Jesus was. Wash my sins away. Oh, happy day. Oh, a happy day. Oh, a happy day. When Jesus was. Oh, when he was. When Jesus was. Wash my sins away, Lord. Oh, it's a happy day.
A very unexpected hit from 1969, the Edwin Hawkins Singers and Oh Happy Day. That's about the time that both my wife and I in different parts of the country were beginning our high school years. We were freshmen at the time that song came out. And those next 4 years, taking us to 1972, we looked at the world, I'm sure, both of us, her on the West Coast, me on the East Coast, wondering what our life would be in just a matter of a few years. The Vietnam War is still going on. People like myself at that age of, let's say, 16 and 17, beginning to wonder about the draft and what we should do for careers. It was a different time, knowing there was always that possibility in the back of our minds as freshmen and sophomores and up until our junior year, wondering where we would be at in a couple of years from now. It's also a time you begin to explore the things you may want to do for a living. Your hobbies become some of your talent. I know for me, radio was something that I really wanted to be in. And from 1969, going forward, my interest in radio broadcasting became very piqued. I loved the engineering side. I liked being on the air. I loved it all. And by 1972, I was already working in radio as I was finishing up my senior year of high school, working at a local commercial radio station in a little village called Newark, New York, way far away from Newark, New Jersey. This is a small town north of the Finger Lakes, south of Lake Ontario, about 35 miles east of Rochester. A small community. Agriculture was a big part of our county. And a lot of people worked in Rochester, New York, not that far away. Newark became kind of a bedroom community, great place to live and grow up. It had winters, it even had summer occasionally. And it was a different time, and I enjoyed those years that I was in high school and when I started my career in radio in that little community. But I made a decision in 1972 to learn more about the electronic side, and I graduated in June of that year, 1972. Worked the summer at the local radio station, which is what I really wanted to do. I wanted to be on the air. I thought that would be my career for many years to come. But that little voice inside said, you need to know more about the technical side, about the electronics, which I really had a passion and desire for. I had built a lot of electronic projects, and I kind of loved it as a hobby. And I could see it being a part of my career. And I, along with a couple of other guys I graduated with in high school, we headed to a town in Ohio, Cuyahoga Falls, just outside of Akron, to attend an electronics school, a 2-year program. And I've met a lot of people over the years that went to one of their schools around the United States. They had one in Kentucky, one in Texas, and the one up in Cuyahoga Falls. And a lot of people made good livings in electronics from the training that they got at those schools. And I was one that really enjoyed my time there. I worked at a radio station part-time and also did my studies and learned a tremendous amount about the emerging technologies of the day, which have given birth to the computer chips that we rely on so extensively in our smartphones and computers today. To be a part of that, to be 17, not even quite 18 when I graduated high school, and heading out that summer at age 17 to a place about 5 hours from where I lived, to start a life like a bachelor at age 17 and put myself through school. I can remember getting in my little car. It was sometime in late August. And everything was loaded up in the back seat and in the little trunk of my little car. And I made my way from that little town in upstate New York to Akron and Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, to start my education. I remember so vividly driving. My car had a little radio that I had put in, a little AM radio. And as I was coming into Cuyahoga Falls, I put on one of the local radio stations there, WCUE. It was the big top 40 station in that market. And I remember listening to this particular song as I rolled into that town for the very first time to live there, and within a couple of days being a student. From the summer of 1972, the Doobie Brothers, and Listen to the Music.
Don't you feel it growing day by day? People getting ready for the move. Some are happy, some are sad. Oh, we gotta let the music play. What the people need is a way to make them smile. It ain't so hard to do if you know how. Gotta get a message, get it on through. Lord, now mama got you happy while. Whoa, whoa, listen to the music. Whoa, whoa, listen to the music. Whoa, whoa, listen to the music all the time. Well, I know you know better everything I say. Meet me in the country for a day. We'll be happy and we'll dance slow. We're gonna dance the blues away. If I'm feeling good to you and you're feeling good to me, there ain't nothing we can do or say. Feeling good, feeling fine. Oh, baby, let the music play. Oh, listen to the music. Oh, listen to the music. Oh, listen to the music all the time. Like a lazy flowing river, surrounding castles in the sky, and the crowd is growing bigger. Listening for the happy sound, got to let it fly. Oh, listen to the music. Oh, listen to the music. Oh, listen to the music all the time.
From the summer of 1972, the Doobie Brothers, and Listen to the Music. You know, for us baby boomers born in the 50s, raised in the 60s, and started our life, our college years in the 1970s, began to get married and have families. The 70s were a transitional time. The Vietnam War had come to an end, and we had peace at home. But the economy was a little bit uncertain, and it was not as easy to do the things that maybe our parents had hoped we could do. But we somehow managed to get through it. Many went on to college, some to trade schools, some went right to work. A lot of us got married and started having families. And the 70s then transitioned into the 1980s when we enter our 30s, those acquiring years. A different kind of sound on the radio, a different kind of music than we'd ever seen before. And hopefully a peacetime dividend, because before the end of the 1980s, the Cold War as we knew it would come to an end. Many of us, myself included, made some career changes during that time to better provide for our families and have a better standard of life. And the 1980s had a variety of music. I couldn't even begin to share all the different sounds that you would hear during that time. But there's one song that kind of stands out, at least to me, one of maybe a dozen or more, that kind of represent the sound that gave way from the 1970s into the 1980s and prepared us for the 1990s when we would turn into our 40s. This one here on your weekend show I'd like to play for you. By the way, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. And if you want to find out more about the program, visit our website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. Or follow us on Facebook. Just look for Your Weekend Show. Love to hear from you this week. As I said, the 1980s, most of us baby boomers were into our 30s. And life is changing. We're beginning to get a little older and hopefully even a little wiser in the things that we do in life. We're beginning to take hold of life and take charge of the things we're supposed to do. You know, there's a biblical admonition: when I was a child, I spoke like a child, but now that I'm a man, I take on the things of being an adult. I sometimes wonder if many of our youth today will ever get to that point. That's just my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope that I am wrong. But I can remember hearing songs like this in the 1980s as my career shifted and life changed once again, as it always does for everybody. Phil Collins in the air tonight from the 1980s. This weekend program this weekend has been kind of a journey through the decades of a baby boomer's life. I know that a lot of folk that listen to the program, especially on shortwave across North America, are probably pretty close to my age bracket. And you may have remembered many of these songs and the events that occurred during those times, and maybe it reminds you of a time in your life as well. I'm going to pick up next week on this same theme as we go through these years together and remember what life has been like. You know, I'm at a point in life now that I look back on all the things that I've done, all the places that I've been, all the experiences that I've had, both good and bad. And I look back with a sense of actually contentment, because maybe I didn't get as wealthy as some of my peers, but you know, I've got a wealth inside of me that I can't even begin to describe. The opportunities that I've had, the people that I've met, the experiences that I've had in my life growing up in the time that I did. All in all, our parents gave the baby boomers a better life than they had for the most part. It's what we make of our lives each and every day that counts. I'm at that point where I'm beginning to use my time more wisely on things that are more important, and I hope you are getting to that point in life as well. We'll pick up on this theme next week as we look at life and all that can be experienced. I want to remind you, this is Your Weekend Show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. Our website, yourweekendshow.com. That's yourweekendshow.com. And visit us on Facebook. You can see us at Your Weekend Show. Make it all one word. Until next week at this very same time, this is Bob Biermann wishing God's greatest blessings upon you.
It's Your Weekend Show with Bob Biermann.